Welcome to a very special webinar called PEACEWORK. I am thrilled to have with me today two good friends and well-known activists for the cause of peace in the world, actor Martin Sheen and Father John Deere. Most of you may be familiar with Martin Sheen from his work on television, on screen, and on the stage. But what you may not know about Martin Sheen is he has a long commitment to peace and is a vocal advocate for equity and justice. As an activist, he's been arrested more than 60 times for his nonviolent acts of civil disobedience. Martin Sheen is a man of strong Christian faith, a faith that fuels and guides his life, a faith that calls him to be a peacemaker. As well, we are joined by Father John Deere. He was a cherished friend of Henri Nouwen's, and while Henri was alive, John challenged Henri to use his platform to work for peace and justice. John is the co-founder of Campaign Nonviolence and the Nonviolent Cities Project and the Beatitude Center for the Nonviolent Jesus. He's been nominated many times for the Nobel Peace Prize. He's authored and edited 35 books on peace and nonviolence. John has traveled to war zones and has been arrested 85 times for his non-violent opposition to war and to the weapons of mass destruction. Martin and John, I am so honored that you would be with us for this very special episode of PEACEWORKS. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
I am delighted to have you. Thank you for coming. I'm curious, just from the two of you, here we are going into Advent. What does Advent mean to you? Why don't I start with you, Martin? Is it a season that is special in your life?
Oh, God, yes. I love Christmas. It's my favorite time. I grew up in the Midwest in Ohio, and it was a large family. There were 10 kids in my family, 9 boys, 1 girl. Both of my parents were immigrants. My mother from Spain, my father from Ireland. So they were very Catholic, and we were raised Catholic. And I went to a Catholic grade school in Dayton called Holy Trinity. The church is still there, but unfortunately the school is closed for lack of interest. But I grew up there, and the Sisters of Notre Dame were our teachers, and they were my heroes because these women were all from the same class that we were. Their fathers were carpenters and bricklayers and painters and mechanics and so forth, like my dad was. So they understood our problems, and they made education an adventure. And I was really formed by their compassion and their understanding of who we were. They knew we were always a dollar short and a day late, and so they would always leave the door open to give us a break and never make us feel that we were a problem for them, as I say, because they came from the same background. So I had that upbringing, and Christmas was always the best and biggest feast of the year. It actually began, of course, with Thanksgiving. And then from then on, it was just a joyous occasion. Couldn't wait for Christmas. It was so exciting. The only problem with Christmas is the next day. It's so depressing after such a high. And I still feel that way. I love Christmas. And I say, God bless it.
That's lovely. How about you, John? Tell us a little bit about Advent as a time of getting ready in your life. What's that about?
Well, as I've grown older, as Martin as well, I've been, looking at the life of Jesus from the perspective of Gandhi and Dr. King. It's the epitome of nonviolence. Gandhi says he's the greatest person of nonviolence who ever lived. So Christmas is the birthday of the greatest person of nonviolence. Here's a world of total violence. And here we're celebrating the birth of the greatest peacemaker. So much so that I love the story in Luke that the angels appear to the poorest of the poor and start talking about the coming of peace on earth.
Mm.
And I love that. So, and then Jesus will teach nonviolence and call us to be peacemakers in the Sermon on the Mount. And he'll model it, this life with his spectacular campaigns like Gandhi and Dr. King. And then when Jesus is, after he's killed and rises from the dead, he comes back and says, okay, peace be with you. Now you follow me. So I've always seen, now may just be me. I may be the only one on the planet, but Advent is a time of preparing for peace, which I love. And I was raised that way in the Jesuits, that Advent is a time of prayer and really hope and looking toward refocusing our lives on the nonviolent Jesus and saying, okay, things are worse than ever, but my focus is on him, and I'm going to be a peacemaker, and I'm going to do my part to prepare for the coming of peace on earth, for the Christmas gift of peace and the Easter gift of peace. And that's what Martin and I have both tried to do with our lives. And it's been very exciting.
You know, this makes it, I'm so excited that we can offer this to people that want to, in a sense, enter into Advent in a special way. I think you guys are going to be such a wonderful challenge. Now, I know the two of you have known each other for almost 40 years, and it started way back with Daniel and Philip Berrigan, I believe. And tell me a little bit about that history. How was it that they played a part in your life? And I think ultimately you got arrested there. They brought you into PEACEWORK and you became part of what was going on. Tell me about that.
From my part, I was raised Catholic, as I mentioned earlier, but I, like so many young Catholics in the 50s and 60s, I thought I should shed that because it was for me, it was a hindrance to the life I wanted to live as a young actor in New York City in 1959. And so I really stopped practicing. I didn't really leave the church any more than God leads us alone. We always think we're looking for God, and no, God is always there. We're looking for ourselves, you know. But at any rate, I came back to the faith in 1981 due to a lot of circumstances in my life that led me back to the church. But I came back to the church. I came back to a much different church because Vatican II had happened in the interim. And I was astonished at all the changes, and I welcomed them wholeheartedly. And I began to realize that I was not re-entering the church that I had left. This was a much different church. This was John the 23rd's throwing the door open and letting in some fresh air. And it was a much needed breath of fresh air. And so I didn't want to return to the church of feeling like if I didn't behave myself, I'd end up in hell. Although I still have a measure of that. But I wanted to come back to the Church of Social Justice. The movement in Central America had begun of liberation theology and such. And Daniel Berrigan was leading the laity and the people concerned since the Vietnam War, and we're still continuing with protesting the nuclear armament and acquisition, the arms race in the early 80s. And so I came back to that church. I wanted to come back to the church of service, of Dan Berrigan, of Mother Teresa, of John Deere, of people who were taking the gospel as if it were true, as Phil Berrigan once said, and living it and practicing it. And these were the most extraordinary people, because despite all of the burdens of our culture, they were happy and they were free. They were not looking for success. They went to demonstrations and performed nonviolent civil disobedience constantly, and they were never conscious of trying to succeed, as it were. The notion seemed to be that the success is in your commitment, that you can't, success is not going to be something that you can put on a ledger. and you won't change the world. If you change, the world has changed. And so that I embraced. And I came to New York to participate in a documentary about I think it was the first plowshare action with Dan and Phil, and the participants in the King of Prussia, Pennsylvania protest, where these plowshares entered the King of Prussia plant where the MX-12 was assembled. They poured their blood, they prayed until they were arrested, and then they went on trial. And they defended themselves in the trial. And of course, they were all found guilty. But Emile D'Antonio, a documentary filmmaker in New York at the time, wanted to do a documentary of the trial. And he wanted the defendants, including Dan and Phil, and John knows them all personally as well, would play themselves. And we would use the script. The script would be the trial transcript, and that would be the presentation. And he asked me to play the judge. And so I said I would. And unfortunately, my oldest living brother at the time passed away very suddenly. And so I had to delay my trip to New York. And so when I finally got there and began my participation in the film, Dan Berrigan came up to me during a break in the filming and introduced himself. And that was my introduction to the change in my life. And that was in the summer of 1981. So I've been guilty ever since, thank God.
That's a lovely story. Did you end up getting arrested at some point with Dan?
It took about another 5 years before I had enough courage, I'm such a big sissy, to participate in a demonstration. And it was with Dan. And in fact, the day of the demonstration, 60 Minutes was doing a feature on Dan and Phil. Right. And so Mike Wallace was at the demonstration. John, I don't know if you remember this, but he was interviewing some of us along the way on 42nd Street. We were going to protest Reagan's so-called Star Wars. And that initiative was going to place, and the plan was to place nuclear weapons in outer space in order to protect us from an attack on the United States. These missiles in outer space with nuclear weapons would shoot down any nuclear weapons aimed at the United States. They didn't account for any mishaps or misdirections or any of the things that usually happen, best laid plans of mice and men. It was finally scrapped, but that was the initiative. And so they were protesting at 42nd Street. It's the old publishing house, what was it, John?
I forget, but it's the Riverside Research Institute.
That's it.
Was the name of the place.
Yeah.
It's since closed, and they were doing this high-end laser beam warfare studies right there in Times Square. And Martin tagged along with Dan one day with our little group. We were getting arrested every 3 months for 30 years there. And you said it was a great day for you, Martin.
It was one of the great days of my life. Yeah. It was the first time I'd been arrested for social justice. And I'd done it nonviolently, and I'd done it joyfully, thanks to this wonderful group of activists that included yourself and Dan Berrigan and some of the early, I think Art Laffin was there, as a matter of fact.
All the usual suspects, all your friends were still all friends. Yeah. And that was the first of many. And it's been downhill for you ever since.
Like the first time, what did it feel like being arrested? And what was that experience like for both of you? First time, I'm curious.
Well, John has taken it far more serious and to a complete other level than what I've been involved in. My total amount of time spent in the jails and some of the places where we protested has just been a few days, frankly. John has done quite a bit more, so I'm going to leave him to. I was always looking for the cameras and the women and children, because then I knew that was the safest demonstration to go to. If I didn't see any cameras or women and children, I was a big sissy.
I'm thinking of Martin, because he won't say it, but you know, he's one of the only less than a handful of celebrities who've used all his fame and good name totally at the service of people struggling for justice and peace, even to the point of many of us getting arrested regularly. It was and is astonishing that he's done that. And Dan and Phil, we were all in awe of Martin. I mean, there's really maybe only Jackson Browne and Jane Fonda who've done that like Martin has. And I mean, you know, you think about who supported Gandhi, who supported Dr. King. Martin was very close to Cesar Chavez, and Martin was very close to the Berrigans. And pretty much every peace and justice group in the country, from Pax Christi to causes working with the homeless. And, you know, we're getting arrested regularly, but when Martin came, it would be front page news and would highlight the issues, so much so that they closed the Riverside Research Institute on Times Square. Like this works. You know, we were just a handful of, we were like out of the movie Godspell, or like out of the Acts of the Apostles. Martin, that's why he just thought we were nuts, because we're singing songs and Dan is really telling jokes and we're being hauled off laughing. And then we'd be in jail laughing. And that's what he's trying to express to you. It's very hard to understand. And they all said Martin Luther King and Gandhi were just like that too, really having quite a good time while you're speaking out against the end of the world and injustice. I entered the Jesuits and lived in community with Dan, and Dan and Phil were both like, when I was 21, they were like smoking cigarettes saying, "Go and get arrested, kid, and report back to me." I'm not kidding you. Phil Berrigan was like that to me. And it wasn't a friendly thing. It wasn't a joke. It was like, yeah, do that, and then maybe I'll take you seriously. But Martin and I looked up to these mythic figures so much. I mean, Karen, they were like biblical prophets. It was like being with Jeremiah, right, Martin? And
yeah,
Ezekiel.
very much so. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I felt being around Dan and Phil was like, oh, this is what it was like to be around St. Peter and St. Paul. You just never met anybody like these guys.
Wow.
But I remember you told me once in passing, Martin, that, you know, and Martin's met everybody on the planet, and he's saying to me, Dan's the funniest person he ever met. You know, remember that, Martin? And, you know, people are so scared of Daniel Berrigan, but Martin would call me, we'd be having mass, and Dan would say the funniest things at mass. And it just gave us so much hope and life. There was a sense of resurrection in what we were doing. It wasn't just, as Henri Nouwen wrote, saying no. We were saying yes to life and living life and having an experience of Christianity that you read about in the Acts of the Apostles, where like we were like, wow, we got to be part of the movement with Dan Berrigan and Cesar Chavez, what those friends of Gandhi and Dr. King must have felt like. And, you know, we had our moments, but, you know, I was looking at the Henri Nouwen book, Peacework, Prayer, Resistance, Community. We experienced community together, right, Martin, with our
very
friends.
So.
And with, and that's the key thing that's very hard to describe, that nobody talks about. And you wouldn't find it in the church the way we found it. Like, these folks are our lifelong friends, these troublemakers.
Well, your path has been marked by the success of having made a difference. You really have. I mean, that's something that you have done. And I look at, there's all sorts of kinds of experiences here, but I'm curious about one. The name has come up a couple of times already in the conversation. You were in the movie Gandhi, Martin. And I'm curious about how what being in that movie and that person has meant in your life. What did you find in Gandhi that shook you and it was memorable? Well,
the experience took me to India, and that was the difference. I could have gone there for any movie, frankly, but it was not so much the movie, because I knew the script. I knew historically, I knew his life, and it had a great influence on me. But it was the influence of India being present in that despicable poverty and being open to it and receptive to it. And poverty, as Mother Teresa described and as Gandhi described, poverty has a smell. It has a ambiance. It has a reality. And when you come from the West and you're in the middle of that, and if you're fortunate enough to spend enough time there to allow it to grip you, it is life-changing. And that's what did it for me. It was that experience that eventually led me back to Catholicism, because I found myself in situations where I was the only Westerner, the only foreigner in some of these neighborhoods, in some of these villages, these isolated places, where the poverty was so overwhelming that you just wanted to escape it. And at the same time, I began to realize that many Westerners come to India looking for a spiritual path, either a guru or some other sense of transcendence, but they're walking right through the places and the people that will give you those experiences. I remember the very first day, Emilio was, my oldest son was with me, and we got into a cab at the airport, and we're driving through Delhi, and we're in the backseat of this tiny little cab. So we're just this close to the driver in the front seat. And we both looked at each other in horror when we realized he was a Sikh. And I mean, no, I'm not making any judgment. It's just a reality that we saw that there were lice on his, crawling behind his head. And we saw it and we thought, he doesn't seem to feel it. And so it was an acceptable existence for him. He was a very poor man to begin with. And I thought, we're not in Kansas anymore. And we just opened ourselves to that. Emilio would go out every day and he'd hide some rupees in his shoes. He'd give everything else away, including his shirt. And he'd come home barefoot sometimes and penniless. And he kept encouraging me, you've got to go out into the streets. You've got to realize this. And so I did. And it made a profound impression. That level of poverty, we just can't imagine it. It's what Mother Teresa dealt with on a daily basis, and she helped the world to realize it, and it changed my life. And so it was that experience of India. Gandhi was the vehicle that got me there. India was the vehicle that sent me back to the Church of Mother Teresa and John Deere and Dan Berrigan.
Well, I know the two of you have met Mother Teresa, and that raises us a question. John, what impact did she have on you? What did you find there? And I'd love to hear from both of you, because you've both met her.
Well, yeah, maybe Martin, you'll tell that great story about your colleague, Tony, who kept saying, "How do you do this?" I love that. You know what I'm talking about, Martin? But I was involved with Mother Teresa for maybe the last 7 years of her life, arranging for her to speak on the telephone to a governor in the United States a day or two before a scheduled execution. And she would, intervene, and we saved 8 lives. 8 people were not killed by that. That meant I had maybe 25 phone calls with Mother Teresa and many letters from her. And I had an incredible, funny experience visiting with her in Rome, where she made fun of me. Martin, can you believe that?
No, I can't imagine.
With me. But I just in the nutshell, and then I want Martin to tell the story. People don't know her stand against war and the death penalty. And you remember, Martin, when I was in jail for the plowshares, she wrote me a letter saying, "I'm going to come and visit you." I remember too, I got thousands of letters when I'm facing 20 years in prison. And Martin, remember this? And everybody is saying, "Oh, John, we're so sorry that you're in prison and you're facing years." And then I get this letter from Calcutta from Mother Teresa, and she says, "Oh, thank God you're in prison. I'm so happy. Oh, it's about time we have a priest in prison suffering with Jesus. John, I'm so proud of you." Can you imagine? And of course, she was right. And that's when she was saying, "I can't wait to come and meet you. Now we're getting somewhere." But she was doing it because of Jesus. And The first time I called her, it was here in California, and I arranged for her to speak to the governor, and then I was going to call her back and get a statement from her, and then go out and have a press conference. We had this big press conference. CNN held it live. And I call her, and I said to her, "So did you talk to the governor?" Duke Majan at the time. And she said, "Yes, John, I did." I said to her, "What did you tell him?" And she said, "I told him to do what Jesus would do." And I said, "Is that it? Like, is that all? Did you tell the guy not to kill him?" And she said, "No, John, I didn't say that. I told him to do what Jesus would do." And Martin, I started arguing with her. Like, why didn't you tell the governor not to kill the guy? So I went out and gave this press conference, and I said, in effect, what Mother Teresa meant to say was, and Jesus wouldn't kill the guy. And that's, don't be like Pilate. Anyway, that had a huge impact on me, because what Mother Teresa did, and I've been doing it ever since. You've heard me do this, Karen, is put the focus back on Jesus. So when I hammered on a nuclear weapon and get arrested, and I'd be literally hauled into bishops and provincials, and they'd say, "Why did you do this?" I would say, "Jesus."
It's a hard one to fight back on.
And everybody would go, "Well, he's crazy." But I saw how Mother Teresa did that. Now, Martin's got a great story about Mother Teresa along those lines. And Jesus.
Well, I got a couple of stories, but the first time I met her, I got a call from our mutual friend and lawyer, Joe Cosgrove. And this was during the first Gulf War in 1990-91. And he called me one day and said, I'm going to Rome on a peace mission to end the war in the Gulf, and I'm inviting you to join me. And I said, "Oh, great. When are you going?" He said, "Well, you got to be in New York tomorrow. I've made a reservation on Alitalia to Rome, leaving from JFK tomorrow. I'll see you at the airport if you come." I said, "Okay, fine." So I went to New York, and Joe greets me at Alitalia. And as we're heading for the plane, I said, "Well, Joe, where is everybody for the peace?" He said, "No, it's just you and me." I said, "What?" He said, "I'll explain it on the plane." This is
Martin's getting involved with us crazy peacemakers.
Yeah, this is Dan Berrigan's lawyer. This is John and I. This is our lawyer. Extraordinary man. And so he explains to me that he had a connection to Mother Teresa. He knew her confessor. And so that she had agreed to meet him with whoever came with him in Rome to take a writ, a legal writ to the Pope, who then was John Paul II, to stop the war in the Gulf, and that they would appeal to the World Court, and that Joe said he would represent the Vatican pro bono at the World Court to stop the war. And so I said, "And it's just you and I, Joe?" He said, "Yeah, and hopefully Mother Teresa." I said, "Oh, Jesus, okay, fine." So we go to Rome, and we barely got into the hotel when the call came that she was receiving. So we went straight away, and she was meeting with her community, the Missionaries of Charity in Rome. It was a converted chicken house, and it's no joke. That's what they house chickens there, and they abandoned that, and she took it over, and now it was their convent, and it was an extraordinary place. At any rate, we were escorted in the chapel, and then into the vestibule, and it was piled with shoes and clothes for poor children and all. And there was a little coffee table, and a sister came in and said, "Mother will be with you in a minute. Have a big cup." So we sat down. Boom! The door opens, and there she is, and you just break into tears, because you cannot, the presence is so powerful. And the only thing that is disconcerting is how tiny she is. And so you try to shrink because you don't want to be taller than Mother Teresa. I mean, that's embarrassing. And she is very disarming. "Oh, all the way from America. Oh, blah, blah, blah. Okay, sit down, sit down. Now, what can I do for you?" And Joe explains that she was going to go see the Pope the next day. And would she carry this writ, this legal document, that would allow him to represent the Vatican at The Hague to end the war. You can't go to The Hague, the World Court, as an individual, but you can go as a nation. And the only nation in the world that was opposing the Gulf War and was asking the litigants, both Saddam and George Bush the first, to the peace table was the Vatican. So he had entree to the World Court. And so Joe explained all this to Mother. And Mother looked off wistfully, and she'd never heard of the World Court. And Joe said, "Oh yeah, it's been going for quite a while." And she looked off wistfully and said, "And how do they make them obey?" Joe said, "Oh no, sister, it's a moral frame of reference. It's not. I mean, they can't force." And he explained that Nicaragua had taken the United States to the World Court for mining their harbors and killing their people with the Contras and so forth. And the United States sent an empty chair. Reagan didn't even send anyone to represent them. And Nicaragua won this huge severance, and they never got a penny, of course. At any rate, Mother said, okay, she would do it. And she was seeing the Pope the next day. And would we stay in Rome and come to Mass? And I think the Mass was at 6 o'clock in that chapel the following Friday. We said. And meanwhile, she said, "And what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm there." And she started asking Joe about some of the people on death row and people we knew. So she would give us little medals and bless them and give them for each member of our family and so forth. And then she said, "Remember," and she grabbed Joe's hand and put it on the table and pointed to his fingers and said, "You did it for me, whatever you do." And I thought, wow, Joe's hand was suddenly sacramental. What about me? And she read my mind. She grabbed my hand, threw it on the table and said, "You did it for me. Remember, whatever you do, remember that on your hand. You did it for me." And then
I don't remember
you're
that
doing has a different connotation. At any rate, we waited and came the Friday morning, we were back at Mass. And the word came that the war had ended. And Joe looked at me and he said, "Don't mess with Mother."
That is a great story. My goodness. Wow. I'm just curious, did you ever wash your hand again? I'm sure you did. You did it for me.
Thinking of the great feast of the entrance of our Savior into the human race. For me, it's so profound. And Dan Berrigan sent me a Christmas card. One's my favorite card. I still have it. And it's a quote from Thomas Merton that I want to share. And this is a Christmas card from Thomas Merton. And he said, "Into this world, this demented inn, in which there is absolutely no room for him at all, Christ comes uninvited." I think the message of Christmas is so powerful, because if we really think, as John pronounced Jesus nonviolent, the first time in my life I ever heard that phrase, his first Mass, when he turned to the crowd and said, "May the grace and peace of God our Father, fellowship of the Holy Spirit, and the love of the nonviolent Jesus be with all of you." I was stunned. We'd never heard the phrase nonviolent Jesus. And that became a key to my Catholicism and my Advent approach. Yeah, it is a nonviolent, this helpless baby that we have to care for, and that baby lives inside of us. We have to care for it. It gets damaged and often starves to death and is brutalized and is aborted and so forth. And that is what we're called to do. It's the nonviolent Jesus. And nobody really wants to deal with this guy, because when you see him coming, you better run, unless you are really committed to embracing that. How often in the Gospels we're told, like the young man walked away, and he sadly walked away, and Jesus loved him. You had compassion. And how often we hear stories in the gospel, like John said, when he came back after the resurrection, he didn't say, "Where were you when they were taking me away and crucifying me?" No, he said, "Peace be with you, and hope everything's all right, because we're just beginning now." Yeah. It's the only miracle of the gospel, sorry to go on and on like this, that has no witnesses. They're witnesses after the fact, but nobody actually saw it. And it is the center of our faith, is the resurrection. And peacemakers, Henri Nouwen says, and I was just going over this again, John, this book that you published with Henri Nouwen's measures on peace and
The
social
road
justice.
to peace.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he talks about community more than anything, and how he came into those communities of Dan and Phil and Art Laffin and the Catholic worker people all over this country, this wonderful service that Dorothy Day began, and how we are a part of community. And it takes the level of a community to have any effect at all. And it may only be on the community, as we were talking before about, if you're looking for success and you're in the peace movement, or if you're looking for social justice and so forth, you may only find it in yourself. And that's fine. That's as it should be in the beginning. You can't think about, we're going to have some success now. We've got enough people here to make a go of it and end the arms race, or end injustice or racism, or all the problems we face as a people. No, we have to remember that Jesus comes uninvited. Nobody really wants to deal with this guy, particularly us in the West. I mean, we're so comfortable. We're so isolated. We're so frightened of change. And Jesus says, hey, man, it's about change. It's a new ball game now.
One of the things that really has struck me, John, you sent me many questions and hints of the various things that the two of you have been involved in. I was so touched to see how long it took. That, the very thing that Martin's talking about, success is maybe what happens inside of you. But I was thinking about the Nevada desert experience, how you organized Lenten civil disobedience actions every year in Nevada. What was that like? And it took so long, and 25,000 people were arrested over those years. That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and Martin and I have been very involved with that, and all the leaders are close friends of ours. But, the way I look at it, as Martin was saying, is, well, basically, as peacemakers, we are seeking the reign of God, the gift of peace on earth. What does that mean? Well, it's a new world of nonviolence. So a world without war, poverty, racism, nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, or any kind of violence. We are on a journey as peacemakers to the coming of God's reign of peace, which Christmas is the beginning of. But if you want to be in this for the long haul, as Dan taught Martin and I, you got to give your life for the vision, and yet let go of results and success at the same time. And that's where Mother Teresa had that great line, we're called to be faithful, not successful. And so you just keep at it. And I love Martin, how Martin Luther King used to say at the very end of his life, all I'm looking for is to leave a committed life behind. And I think that's what all of us are trying to do, to say we are on the side of the nonviolent Jesus. We're on the side of peace in a world without war and poverty and violence. And it's achievable because change happens through bottom-up people power, grassroots movements, from Jesus to Gandhi and Dr. King. And we're all trying to do our little bit. What was so amazing is that this very close friend of ours, Father Louis Vitale, a Franciscan in California, in the late 1980s, says, somebody's got to do something about them testing nuclear weapons in Nevada. So in Nevada, there's this massive military base, the Nevada test site, which is larger than the state of Rhode Island, where they've exploded thousands and thousands of nuclear bombs above ground in the 1950s and then below ground up until the 1990s. So Louis calls Martin and our friends like Father Bill O'Donnell and Dr. Davida Cody and all the usual suspects. And he says, we're going to go to the entrance way out in the desert every year in Lent and walk onto the desert and get arrested until they stop doing this insanity. And Martin and I go, okay. So thousands of people started to go. And it was really like a Catholic worker kind of organization. It was very haphazard, not well organized, no money involved. We get several hundred people for Ash Wednesday and the first weekend in Lent, have a little retreat, have a mass, go out to the desert, and then literally there was a line in the road, cross the line, and they would put us in a chain link fence for the whole day and then release us. So it was a misdemeanor. I used to call it civil disobedience 101. Well, we all had a marvelous day. Yeah, no, I used to send people out there because it was a good place to learn how to do this. Right, Martin? You know?
Yes, very much.
It was
so, yeah.
friendly. Well, we all became really good friends with the cops and the chief of the police. I mean, Martin was a friend of all of theirs. And then it just became a part of our lives. Like many of these places, the School of the Americas, Riverside Research in New York, demonstrations in DC and in LA with a Catholic worker. So every Lent we were going out there, and occasionally they'd have really larger events. Dom Helder Camera came once, all kinds of marvelous people. Dan was there. But oh my gosh, we shouldn't tell you, but we had fun. It's hard to be repenting when you're having such a good time with all your friends. And we would always have mass that Sunday morning out there in the desert. I remember so many beautiful experiences. And then we'd cross the line. When Martin and I were speaking in Norway to the launch of the international campaign for the abolition of nuclear weapons about 10 years ago, I think, Martin told a hilarious story about these friends of ours. We were practicing Easter instead of Lent. Remember, Martin, these women
From
who
the Catholic
would do
workers,
that song?
yeah. The Catholic worker
Catholic
people,
worker.
the women.
You tell the story. And they would march up to the... It's so goofy. But this is our experience of the movement. They would march up to the line and the cops would come to arrest them with the machine guns. And they would join hands and start singing, you put your right foot in, you put your right foot out, you turn around and do the hokey pokey. And the cops would go to grab them and they would step back. And everybody would burst into laughing. This would go on as the cops would go to grab, and then you'd get the cops laughing.
They were laughing. Then they started laughing.
They were laughing. And then you'd say, we don't have anything against you personally. We're here to try to stop the testing of nuclear weapons. This is insane. And it's as insane as singing the hokey pokey. And it was very powerful. And it worked, by the way. That was the kind of Gandhian, Kingian, I think, Jesus level of peace, love, and joy, engaging in civil disobedience as political theater with a little sting to it that eventually wears down the authorities, where, I always say, from the abolitionists to the suffragists, to the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-nuclear movement, in the end, this is what my friend Howard Zinn told me, in the end, the change happens, positive social change happened when ordinary good people broke bad laws and accepted the consequences. If you study the movements, when people just say, well, I've had enough, I'm getting arrested, and you start having priests and nuns and grandmothers and women singing the hokey pokey like they don't care anymore, and Martin Sheen, the authorities have a problem because nonviolence is contagious. This is how it spreads, and the movement can take off. And this is what we've been trying to do through civil disobedience and all the issues to end war and nuclear weapons and racism. This works. But the trick is to keep at it and to be faithful to it, even as you keep going. And it's such a mystery, but it's such a blessing, right, Martin?
Oh, very much so. And speaking of that, John, before you came on, Karen and I were talking and looking, maybe we could find some photographs of you and I at one of these demonstrations. And I remembered this book that was published some years ago. I don't know if you remember this. And they put a picture in there of you and I being arrested at the Capitol. That's in the rotunda in the middle of the Capitol. And there you are right there. And there's Mike Kennedy here. And this, here's another Crow, Reverend Crow from Alabama, I believe. And we were protesting, the Capitol Police are arresting us there. And we were protesting the war in El Salvador.
Oh, right. My goodness.
And but I always remember that you came home and that picture was all over the press around the world. And Charlie said to you, Martin's son Charlie said, that's the worst picture of you ever taken. And that was a kind of a setback for me because it was kind of funny. This was the fun we were having. So that protest was, if you will, if you just bear with me for a second, Karen, that Martin's talking about is January 1990. So in November 1989, the 6 Jesuit priests whom I knew and worked with were brutally assassinated in El Salvador. Yeah. And it set off all kinds of movements and protests across the United States. I organized a massive one in the Bay Area. And I was telling Martin about it. Martin told the Jesuits about it in LA, and they decided to do the same thing at the LA Federal Building. Only what Martin and his friends did was they said, let's get arrested every Wednesday, starting in the new year, January 1990, spend the whole day in jail for shutting down the Federal Building until the war in El Salvador ends. Now, many of us had been to Central America many times, and Martin has been very involved in the Central American movement. And that's, Martin called me, and I went down that first week in January, and 1,000 people were there, and hundreds of us got arrested. And that's how I met Jackson Brown and Ed Asner. That's how Martin met our friend and hero, Reverend James Lawson. And then we did it again every week. I was in grad school at the time. We were on a long fast, Martin. And then I said, hey, Martin, we're all going to DC. We're going to shut down the Capitol until the war ends. And Martin's like, oh, my God. And I dragged him along, and we did it. And we were arrested there that Sunday. And I think Phil Berrigan was with us. But what Martin didn't mention, Karen, and here's the punchline, the war ended 6 weeks later. You know, there was never had been so much pressure on the US Congress in history. They had millions upon millions of letters and calls, and you're shutting down federal buildings against US military aid to El Salvador, which had led to the death of Archbishop Herrera and the 4 women and 75,000 people in the 80s. And now the famous, prestigious 6 Jesuit priests. And so they ended the war around March 1st. And I think that's the power of movement organizing. And Martin was a real leader in all of that. Isn't that amazing, Martin, when you think back on the whole thing?
Well, I never thought of myself as a leader. On the contrary, I always thought it was you and Dan and Phil.
Well,
and
I thought you were leading.
all the other wonderful radicals.
We were all, it was the Holy Spirit leading us and Jesus leading us. And we all pretended we knew what we were doing, but nobody knew what they were doing, actually. Dan Berrigan certainly didn't know what he was doing. And Martin, I think Jesus probably didn't know that much what he was doing. We were all faking it till you make it, right, Martin? Isn't that fun?
There's probably never been a more necessary time for peacemakers, for people committed to peace than we are facing right now. And I'm sure people are listening and going, what can I do? Where can I put my foot in the water? You guys make it sound like fun. But I think what you've done is you've shown up and you've brought integrity to it, and you've been willing to put your lives out in front of people. I would like them all to show up. Actually, John, I think you can keep everybody connected if they show up at the Beatitudes Center for the nonviolent Jesus. So we will direct everybody in that. There'll be links everywhere to put you folks together, because people are going to be listening to this and going, I want to be part of changing the world. And, not to feel overwhelmed by the reality of how dire it is right now.
I just encourage everybody listening to get with their local peace and justice environmental group. I always say nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. Everybody can lend their 2 cents. Look at Joe Sands getting Martin to go to the Vatican. We've all had so many experiences, but it's together we can make a difference. Get with Pax Christi, get with whatever your local group is doing. Pick a cause. Helping to end nuclear weapons with ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or with Pax Christi and efforts to stop the US support of all the wars in Ukraine and elsewhere. And our environmental groups, our friend Jane Fonda has a great group called Fire Drill Fridays, which I'm an active part of. And it's together. If we if we all join in together and pitch in, we can make a difference together. And as Dan told Martin and I long ago, if you want to be hopeful, you have to do hopeful things. You have to take public action, Cesar Chavez told me. And that's been really helpful. So there.
I loved I got reading the PEACEWORK book that you had something to do with. Yes, that one it's lovely. And I was curious because as I was reading it, I found that, you know, I wondered about, Henri was talking about prayer, resistance, and community. And I've heard the community part about it. I've even heard the resistance part. But let's go back to the beginning of that circle and how it's all kind of, does it make sense to you? Has this been valuable to you guys? This Henri's PEACEWORK, his vision there.
Maybe I'll say a word first and then Martin. So the question is, Henri said all peacemaking begins with prayer, Martin. And that's what she's asking about. So what's the connection between prayer and spirituality and peacemaking and nonviolence? It's a great question. And it's been central to my whole life. And I continue to grasp that because we are all people of prayer and meditation and going to church and mass and reading the gospels. Henri is saying, though, Jesus gives us the gift of peace. Peace is a gift from God. And we want to be the people to receive it, to welcome it at Christmas, to welcome it at Easter, to welcome the gift of peace every day of our lives in our quiet prayer, to let God disarm our hearts so that we can be instruments, God's instruments of peace. I love all that. And that's taken me, I mean, Martin's known me since I was a kid, but it's taken me a long, long time to understand that. And where it has led me is to a new understanding of God, that God does not bless war, but that God is a living God of peace, that God is not a God of violence, but the living God of nonviolence, that God doesn't take sides, us against them, but we're called to love our enemies because God practices universal love for every human being on the planet. And nonviolence says, well, therefore, there's no cause, however noble, for which we can ever support the taking of any single human life again. Well, we're called to be people of nonviolence, to be peacemakers. How the heck do you do that? Henri reminds us. Every day you go back to the God of peace. You go back to the nonviolent Jesus and let Jesus teach you and give you peace. And so that every day that those work for peace leads to a life of peace, which is the spiritual life of peace, so that, you know, you can then come to the sayings like Dorothy Day, all the way to heaven is heaven. And that's what Martin and I were trying to describe with our experience of Mother Teresa and Daniel Berrigan and our friendship with ourselves and our many friends. It's been such a rich life of peace, even as we're standing up against very horrific injustices. And so it's a very interesting, mysterious question, how prayer is connected to peace. And let me just end with this thought, and then Martin can speak, but we need to be people as well who intercede for the gift of peace. Christmas should be a time of saying, we want your gift of peace on earth. As I've gotten older, I realize, as Martin said in the Merton quote, we don't want Jesus. We don't want nonviolence, and we certainly don't want peace on earth. There's a lot of money to be made by waging war. We prefer war on earth and war against Mother Earth. Thank you very much. No, as Christians and people of prayer, we're people who say, please give us the Christmas gift of peace on earth. Please come to us, God of peace, in the nonviolent Jesus. And please send us forth on Easter Sunday as peacemakers into the world of war. And that happens in our prayer. That's where we can say to God, we want the war on Ukraine to end immediately. We pray for an end and the abolition of all nuclear weapons and the success of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons and the ban treaty at the UN. And we pray for the end of all gun violence and racism and all the many other wars around the world, the war against the poor, the war which is poverty that Martin was talking about in India, and the war against the earth. And we pray that every human being on the planet may be given the gift of peace and be trained in nonviolence and become a peacemaker. Martin, explain it to us.
Take it away, Martin.
I just want to make Martin laugh. This is your big chance, Martin.
John embodies, and I've been with him so often on the line and been behind him so often when he took the first step into jeopardy and was hauled away, and for justice. And remembering, and as Henri Nouwen so succinctly says, and John, you recounted in this book, he talks about community. And in this, Advent season, try and think of Christmas without community. I mean, it's about community. And the most powerful reality of Christmas is that God becomes human. And we are astonished at that. And it's so hard for us because we want God to be something else. And God says, no, I want to be just like you. I want to feel and experience what it is to be human, and on all those levels, and to the point of being extinguished and not knowing, but trusting. And so we have that example, and that's pretty extraordinary. The idea that we are loved is the most powerful, revolutionary idea in the history of the human race, that we are loved despite our circumstances, despite our past or our present situation. We are loved. And if we do not accept, which is so hard to do, that we are loved because we don't feel we deserve it. It's not about deserving it. It's about being human to it. It's a necessity for our humanity that we accept the reality that we are loved, and we have been loved from the beginning. And so God chooses to dwell here, and he's the last presence that we want to welcome into our midst, because it is so disturbing, and yet it is the road to freedom, to joy. And it leads us to embody that wonderful phrase that Robert Kennedy said once. He said, "One heart with courage is a majority." I think of Jesus when I think of that. He was one heart with courage, and he became a majority because of the truth. He embodies the truth. And so Christmas is a time for reflection within yourself, accepting that you are loved, and with that love comes the responsibility to love others, including your enemies, to embrace your situation, and to think of yourself reflecting how God sees us. I often pray that prayer, God, teach us how to be human, take away our hearts of stone, give us hearts of flesh, that we may see in ourselves what you see in us and reflect your vision on each other. That is what I think Christmas is really all about, that we can see the baby in everyone, and we can accept God's presence in our midst, in our hearts, and accept the responsibility of being loved.
That is good news. That's
Amen, brother.
Good news of the gospel. That's it. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. That's our Christmas message, I think. There's so many more things we could talk about, but I think you've energized us all. I mean, the two of you, thank you. You make it possible. You make it feasible to put your foot in and take a first step and be part of this. And quite frankly, you make it so attractive, you don't want to miss out on it, to be honest. And what I see in both your lives is there's no retiring from it. My sense is if you get a call, you'll be there. You have that sense, you'll go if you're called. And I think God is looking for a whole bunch of us to be so ready to say yes. I'm beloved. I'm glad to answer your call, God, because you made me beloved. You let me know that, and that's for everyone. That's for absolutely everyone. Thank you, gentlemen. What a treat to be with you. What an absolute treat. I am so pleased to bring together these two faithful activists for the cause of peace and social justice. They've given us a lot to consider and be inspired by. And here at the Advent season, they remind us all to welcome the non-violent Jesus, the true Prince of Peace. I hope you've enjoyed this program. We invite you to sign up for the daily meditations. They're free, and it's a wonderful way to stay in touch and be informed about what's happening at the Henri Nouwen Society. I also want to give a special thank you to Father John Deere and to Martin Sheen. Thank you so much for sharing your memories, your lives, your energy, your inspiration. It really has been a pleasure to be with you and to learn from you. And now, from everyone at the Henri Nouwen Society, we want to wish you all God's peace.